So another really interesting World Eaters leak today. Looks like we've got a whole chunk of stratagems unveiled from the Codex, and some new details as to their new Army of Renown. It really seems like the World Eaters might be a Codex with two main ways to play it. The standard issue World Eaters, and what feels like a new equivalent of Khorne Demonkin perhaps. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking World Eaters once more. We've been getting quite a lot of leaks come in over the past couple of weeks for the Codex, though there certainly were some sections where there were some big questions left, particularly the details of the new World Eaters stratagems and their army of renown that was rumoured to focus around Angron and a bunch of Khorne demons. As per the last few leaks, this appears to be a text leak originating from the World Eaters Discord server. No images with this one, but it does seem that the previous text leaks are looking a lot more likely. Everything that we got from them tallied quite well with the Angron profile and the fact that you could resurrect him. I guess we'll be getting a lot more confirmation as to how close they are to reality when Games Workshop teases new things. Obviously treat them as unconfirmed rumours yet, but they do seem very believable to me. Supposedly, these have been looked over by multiple different people with different copies of the playtest codex, and everything seems to tally quite nicely. A really massive thank you to the chap who sent all of that my way and provided a whole bunch of extra details besides. Always fun when some new rules rumours come swimming their way down the rivers of blood. They're a very trustworthy source and have been right about other things in the past. To get into the good stuff though, the leak focuses on a couple of sections. There's some really interesting clarifications as to the Army of Renown, which is apparently called the Disciples of the Red Angel, and apparently we've got all the World Eater stratagems in the book as well, though perhaps the most interesting thing about that is that their numbers seem to be far lower than say the Death Guard or Thousand Sons codexes. It feels like this might be a bit of a new direction for Games Workshop and deciding to reduce their rules bloat a bit, maybe in a bit of a beta test for 10th edition. Let's talk rules though, let's go through the Red Angel formation first, and then through the stratagems. So first up, the Disciples of the Red Angel is the new World Eaters Army of Renown. We had that mentioned on the very big leak that came out a while back, and I must admit I did quite like the idea of it, as it basically feels kind of similar to a Khorne Demonkin army, an army list that's focused on mixing some World Eaters with some demons. I'd say there's probably some positives and negatives to the unit selection. It does sound like, as with a bunch of other armies of renown, it is a bit on the restrictive side. In the formation, you can apparently take Angron, any other World Eaters demon units, and Land Raiders, and then after that, basically just Khorne demons from Codex Chaos Demons. Just from the description of that, it does sound like Angron and the new 8 bound in both their flavours will likely be first and foremost within it. It does seem like a lot of the benefits of the army do revolve around them. Otherwise, on the World Eaters side of things, it sounds like you'll be able to field the various different Khorne demon engines, which is kind of interesting. I guess keywords wise they would check out, as they do generally have the demon keyword, and they'll be World Eaters. And in particular, one of the stratagems references being able to make Titanic vehicles better, which does sound like it's aimed pretty squarely at the Lord of Skulls. Perhaps the main downside though is that apparently you wouldn't be able to field Berserkers or Terminators in this force, as they're not Khorne demons. And I can't help but think that that's just a little bit sad in a way. The Berserkers in particular are pretty much the archetypical unit of World Eaters, and it just seems an odd decision not to allow them into the army, even if you had the focus entirely away from them and say no stratagems that buff them or anything. I just can't imagine a whole load of people who want to play World Eaters, but are of the opinion that no, we don't really want any of those Berserker types in the army. Otherwise though, the Chaos Demons do sound interesting. Supposedly they can mix and match within the same detachment. It does sound like a formation that's a little bit reminiscent of that Disciples of Be'lakor force that we had in Codex Chaos Demons. Potentially some interesting ideas for mixing and matching within the same army. Apparently what you get out of the formation, at least from these leaks, are no extra whole army buffs or anything like that. I imagine that the World Eaters would still keep their +1 strength and attack legion trait. It looks like the major thing that you're gaining from restricting your unit list is access to the demons in the same detachments, and then 8 different stratagems, which will apparently be instead of the stratagems that you get in regular Codex World Eaters, a very different take for an Army of Renown to not add extra rules onto the top, and instead replace the stratagems wholesale. As we'll see in a second, it does sound like World Eaters will just be remaining with 8 base stratagems, despite getting their entire full codex independent of Chaos Space Marines. This would definitely be a departure from Games Workshop, and far less than a standalone codex would normally get. I would bear in mind as well that if you still want to mix Chaos Demons and World Eaters, you're probably still going to be able to do that within regular Codex World Eaters, and then just use the standard ally rules for Chaos Demons. In any case, to get into these juicy blood-soaked stratagems, first up here are the 8 for the Disciples of Angron, then we'll go over the generic World Eaters ones. It does look like most of these are aimed at buffing the World Eaters, and they don't really give much to the demons. First up, for 1 CP, World Eaters units get +1 to wound when their unit is at half strength or less. +1 to wound is pretty powerful, but if the detachment restrictions are right, then I guess that could only apply to 8 bound when they're on 2 models, or exalted 8 bounds when they're on 1, and that's assuming that you took a full squad to start with of the regular 8 bounds. Seems a little bit on the niche side to me. For 1 CP, there's one for 8 bounds to consolidate 6 inches when the enemy falls back. Potentially sounds like a bit of a gotcha moment, that one, so probably one to warn the enemy that it could be coming. It would mean that certain slow moving enemies just literally wouldn't be able to escape from them though, and could be basically as good as locking a unit in combat if it happens to be something that's got 6-inch move or less. Really quite powerful, that one. I feel like that is quite a meaningful one. Next up, there's 1 CP for 8 bounds to move when they lose a model in shooting. That does sound like it's similar to the rumoured one for Khorne Berserkers that we got the other day. I'd guess it would probably have to be closest to the nearest enemy model, but as mentioned previously, if it allows you to engage in combat, or it allows you to hide the squad out of line of sight blocking terrain or something, both of those could be pretty handy, never mind just getting extra distance towards making a potential charge. For 1 CP, there's a nice standard one for vehicles to fight on full profile, or 2 CP if they're Titanic, handy enough to have around. It will kind of depend on vehicles being good enough to be worth running. Maybe things like Mauler Fiends could be okay with the extra attacks or something. I can't help but feel that the focus is going to be on those scary 8 bound and the demons though. For 1 CP, when a World Eater's unit charges, then the enemy can't overwatch, sets to defend, and gets -1 to hit in the ensuing fight phase. Maybe some sort of berserker scream as they charge in. Probably handy enough if it was something with some enormous overwatch, and their melee defense doesn't hurt either. For 1 CP, there's one to auto-advance a World Eater's unit 6 inches. That seems like it'd be handy enough if it's going to make the difference of getting to cover onto an objective. I guess we'll have to wait and see if there's anything to allow units to advance and charge. If there is, then that one will be very big, if not a bit more niche. For 1 command point, a World Eater's unit gets to ignore charge modifiers. That's fair enough if you're charging into difficult terrain, I suppose, but again, not super regular. And finally, for 1 command point, there's one for killing an enemy in combat, and when you do so, your unit gains an aura of -2 leadership and -1 combat attrition for the morale phase that turn. Again, not super excited about that one, being a morale phase debuff and a lot of armies don't care. I guess in theory you could be stacking that with the Demon Fear rule though, so you could get some stacking debuffs on the go if you wanted to try and make morale work. Overall, looks like a few useful bits and bobs. Many does look to be very centered around the 8 bound units. Out of these stratagems, I feel like the consolidate 6 inches when the enemy falls back is pretty handy, plus extra movement in the enemy shooting phase could have some big potential if used in the right time, and a bunch of the others do sound like they'd be pretty usable, but maybe just not ones to plan on using every turn. Overall seems interesting. I'm not 100% convinced that the addition of these stratagems is necessarily going to be worth leaving some of the best World Eaters units at home though, particularly if it loses you all the generic stratagems from the Codex as was rumoured. Talking of which then, let's talk about the reincarnation of the 8 World Eaters stratagems. Again, if the source is to be believed, it does sound like World Eaters are getting far fewer stratagems than any other codex in 9th edition, perhaps representing Games Workshop starting to transition away from them, maybe as they go towards 10th edition, which might feature fewer. First up, we've got Skulls for the Skull Throne, 1 or 2 CP, and it happens when your character slays the enemy warlord. You either get 2 Blood Tithe points for 1 CP, or gain +1 to advance and charge for the rest of the game. If you want both buffs, then it costs 2 CP, but you can choose either one for 1. Kind of situational, it relies on your opponent having exposed their warlord, then you having killed it with a character. Certainly not impossible with Angron around. I guess more of a nice one if it just happens to go off, and then you get some Blood Tithe points for command points if it makes sense to make that trade. For 1 CP, there's Banner of Blood. This one's a 3d6 inches and drop the lowest charge for Berserkers if you have an icon, and this one seems very similar to the Khorne Demons one with the blood letters and their icons, basically a reincarnation of the same stratagem. Definitely a very reasonable looking one to use if you have to make a long charge, potentially could be kind of interesting for Khorne Berserkers piling out of a Dreadclaw drop pod, or maybe the Terminators trying to charge out of Deep Strike. Next up, for 1 CP, we've got Stoke the Nails. This one's a straight up damage dealing stratagem. 1 mortal wound on 6s to wound when you're fighting to a maximum of 6 inflicted. World Eaters get an awful lot of attacks, so that's probably going to add up to a whole chunk of wound rolls. Even just with their unbuffed profile that they get at the moment, a 10-man squad of Khorne Berserkers would likely max you the whole 6 if they got the charge, and that could give them a pretty big powerful punch against anything with powerful damage barriers like great saves, or if they're fighting something that's very tough to wound and they might not have been wounding on anything better than 5s anyway. That one sounds like it could get used in quite a few fight phases if you just need a bit more melee damage. Next up, for 1 or 2 CP, we've got Wild Fury. A core unit gets to fight on death, 2 command points if you're not troops. Fighting on death is a pretty big deal. Certainly people who play Creations of Bile will tell you that. Some armies just largely revolve around melee, and if they're about to kill your units in combat, then for 1 command point to potentially allow a whole chunk of Khorne Berserkers to strike when they die, that could very easily translate into enough damage to be worth the command points. It might depend a little bit as to what gets core and what doesn't. Whether or not the 8-bound gets it or not will be quite a big thing, but otherwise I guess it could be applied to the Terminators, and again they could hit you very hard when they die. For 1 CP, we've got Kill Maim Burn. This one is a heroic intervention of 6 inches as if the unit were a character. It's a very nice threatening one to have on a whole army. It means that your opponent can't put anything within 6 inches of a World Eater's combat unit and not risk being in combat. Very nice for defending objectives, and could even be useful on Angron himself, I guess. Getting a 6-inch heroic intervention means that you'd have to back off even further from him, and it would be absolutely worth trying to get him an extra fight phase if possible. For 1 CP, we've got Smoke Launchers. This one's a bit more boring and just -1 to hit a vehicle that has got the keyword. I must admit, if the Codex really has just got the 8 stratagems, it's kind of sad to have one of them expended on just some generic smoke launchers. As it goes though, it's probably useful enough for World Eaters in general, making the Rhinos just that little bit more durable as they crawl up the field. For 1 CP, there's the return of Scorn of Sorcery. Apparently this one's unchanged and is just 1 command point to deny psychic power on a 4+ within 24 inches, often pretty useful just to throw at a key power for a coin flip chance to make it stop. And finally for 2 CP, we have the reincarnation of Red Butchers. Probably a bit of a mixed feeling to see that one here, seeing as we now know that they weren't getting any Red Butchers Terminators unique models, and it was something that quite a lot of players were hoping for. The stratagem itself looks usable, but it does look like it maybe is shifting even further away from the previous version. According to this leak, it's dispensing entirely with the fights twice on Terminators and things, and instead it just gives you a +1 damage to Terminators or 8-bound when they trigger it in the fight phase. Currently we don't know the actual 8-bound combat stats. I'd imagine that they'd probably be damaged too, but we'll wait and see. Certainly seems very usable for Terminators though. They get a whole ton of attacks with those accursed weapons at good AP, so putting that all up to damage 2 will make them a far more general purpose threat. It does appear that Games Workshop are just entirely pivoting away from any sort of fights twice mechanic for the World Eaters. Looks like that sort of thing is just literally going to be represented by their extra attacks and things, with things like Khan the Betrayer, rather than getting a whole bunch of extra attacks, just gets 9 on his base profile, and presumably going up to 10 with the Legion trait. Overall though, out of the 2 stratagems list, I feel like the generic World Eater stratagems are probably the stronger of the 2. Lots of really usable things here. Banner of Blood for long charges seems great. Stoke the Nails for damage is very nice. Fights on Death seems excellent for when it triggers. I think that looks like it's arguably the single most valuable stratagem in the book if it applies to a whole bunch of scary Khorne Berserkers. Kill Maim Burn is a great one to have access to in the army, even if it achieves nothing more than the enemy having to give you a very wide berth. That's still useful. And Scorn of Sorcery and Red Butchers both seem perfectly good as well. If these do turn out to be true, then it looks like the World Eaters don't have all that many stratagems, but at least the ones that they get are good. So anyway, let me know your thoughts on the leak. What do you make of the Disciples of the Red Angel Army of Renown and the new World Eater stratagems, and what looks like news that Games Workshop is basically cutting down the stratagem bloat a bit? Maybe we'll talk about this a bit more in an upcoming video. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to hear more about the World Eaters, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly cover any other leaks or official previews that we get, and review the Codex in full once it's out. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help keep them coming, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one linked down in the video description if you're interested in helping support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, The link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.